So we've been considering wisdom from a number of different angles in the last number of weeks. And last week, we started a new short series called Wisdom Under a Microscope. And we're saying that wisdom is something that you need to look at closely. You need to examine it in detail. You need to magnify it so that we can understand how it really works. And this morning, we're going to take another step in that process. Last week, Derek Way was here, and he was telling us about studying worms under a microscope, and we learned that there are all of these tiny, tiny things that really affect our lives and really affect our health and our ability to grow crops and all sorts of things, and that there are all of these organisms out there that are part of the system of life. And, I found a picture of Derek at work this past week. There he is up at Cornell, studying away, working hard, and doing his thing with microscopes. The same thing that is true of physical life is true of wisdom. Wisdom is an organism. It is a system of life, but the life is moral life. It's the life that is ethical and spiritual, and the Lord made this world to work in a certain way, ethically and spiritually. Wisdom is that organism. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to start putting this concept of wisdom under a microscope and watching how it behaves. What does wisdom do? You don't just put something under a microscope to look at it still all the time. You want to see what it does that you can't necessarily see with the naked eye. So what we're looking at this morning is the behavior of wisdom, and that behavior has a name. Wisdom acts, takes action, makes decisions. Wisdom does things in our lives through what we call virtues. I want to talk with you about the virtues in this little passage of Proverbs, chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. There are a number of virtues here. Let's think about maybe a good way to consider the virtues. How do we think about this from the point of view of Proverbs? So a lot of you are like Derek. You're doing research. You're doing schoolwork. You have to write papers. And you might be looking at the week ahead and saying, I have to write a paper, and it's a 10-page, 15-page paper, and what am I going to do? I've got so many other assignments that I need to do. I've got, frankly, so many relational issues in my life. I've got stresses in my life. How am I supposed to produce this paper in a week full of this kind of stress? How do I do that? Wisdom speaks to these kinds of problems. And your problems may not be papers. You may be at work. You may be in charge of something, managing people. There's a bunch of problems for you. So you may have different kinds of problems. But just think about that issue that you need to approach this week. A virtue, or all of the virtues together, are habits. They are patterns that we lay down in our lives. We repeat them and repeat them and repeat them. Every single day, week in, week out, month after month, year after year. These habits come to characterize our lives. And in a fallen world like ours, it is very difficult to build these habits and to sustain them. It's easy enough to do the right thing maybe for a day. It's easy enough to maybe last a week. If we're really strong, we can maybe carry on a month doing the right thing, building a habit. But the virtues are lifetimes of habits, patterns that are built into our behavior. And so if we look at this little passage here that we started looking at last week, Proverbs 1 through 7. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity. There's a whole lot of virtues already mentioned right there, but I'd like you to look at verse 4 closely. Let's put this one under a microscope. To give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. So here are three virtues, examples of these habits that if you build them over time, they improve your decisions. They enable you to endure stress, to do the things that you need to do, and do them well, so that you are actually a support and a source of strength to the people around you. So here are three just from these couple of verses. The word prudence. Prudence is the art of looking ahead, the virtue of saying, life isn't always going to be as it is at this moment. Life changes and new decisions and new issues come up. I wonder what some of those things are and how I might be prepared for them. Now, a lot of people say they're prudent, but they're actually indecisive. They're incapable of making a decision, and so prudence becomes a kind of excuse for procrastination. I'm just not going to make this decision right now. Actual virtuous prudence is very active, it is forward-looking, and it is something that takes practice to get right. So here's another one, discretion. This book, Proverbs, will give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. What's discretion? Discretion is seeing the differences between things. Things that are good and bad, right and wrong. Things that are sometimes hard to distinguish. Things like things that are useful versus things that are harmful. Discretion goes even further and distinguishes between essential things, the things that matter the most, and things that are secondary. Things that are good, they're important, but they don't matter as much as the essential things. Discretion, discernment is one of the keys to virtuous decision-making. It's another virtue. Here's another one that is described. It's not named here, but if we look at verse 5, let the wise hear and increase in learning, and let the one who understands have guidance. So you read this book, if you're already wise, what's the thing you see? You see all the ways you're not wise yet. You may have a lot of wisdom, you may be making a lot of progress, but there are things that you don't know yet, and Proverbs reveals that, and so your wisdom grows. What is this called? Humility. The opposite of humility is arrogance. I've got this wired. I already know all this stuff. I don't need this book. I've already learned everything that I need to know. And the only way I'm going to read this book is to check all the boxes that I've already got. Well, that's not humility. The virtue of humility enables you to realize, I don't have life wired. I don't even have part of it wired. There are things going on that I don't understand, that I need to understand. I need more wisdom. I need to build on the wisdom I've got. And so there are three virtues mentioned here, and there are actually 7 different words that are synonyms for wisdom in this one little passage. Those are just 3. Now, what are we saying here? Wisdom is coming to you and saying, I want you to come with me, walk with me, and learn my ways. And so we ask, what are your ways? Wisdom answers, habits. Those boring day-to-day patterns that you lay down in your life, those little things that you do every day will build virtue into your life. That's how I work. That's what I do. That's the way I behave. So, there's something I find pretty liberating about this. I find it liberating to realize that I'm in a process. When I'm learning God's wisdom, I'm not having to take a test and get every answer right and get a grade back. F. Wisdom isn't learned this way. Wisdom is learned over time, and it doesn't mean that you have to get every decision exactly right. It means that you learn over time and build patterns over time, and that's the point. I love that, because so often we think of the Christian life as something where God zaps you with an experience, and now everything is completely different and my whole life is changed. Okay, maybe some things change, but your whole life is not changed. Just because you pray the prayer and you ask Jesus to come into your heart and these things, your whole life changes as wisdom takes over your day and teaches you these habits, these patterns slowly through the little things. I love that because it means that I have time and that I can learn, and that actually is God's expectation, and that His grace enables me to do that. So what I want to do this morning is zoom in even more on these patterns. I want to zoom in on one virtue, and let's just see how important this one thing is. And then you can go back into this and say, wow, that's just one virtue. Here's 6 more. And these are just the 6 mentioned in this passage. If we can kind of drill down on this one virtue and see how it behaves, then we can learn something about how to build these virtues in God's grace. The virtue is prudence. I want us to ask, how would you build prudence? How would you go about doing that, building that kind of habit into your life? So I'll tell you about a paper that I had to write. So I was in my PhD program in the mid-teens, not my mid-teens, I mean the 11 through 17. And in those years, I was also, at the same time, restarting a church. You might say, that doesn't sound very prudent. Doesn't sound quite smart to do those 2 things at the same time, restart a church and start a PhD program. Well, I felt God had called me to do both. I felt He had been leading me independently in those directions, and as I look back, I still feel that way. I'm still convinced. He called me to those 2 paths at the same time, and He called me to step out and do it. Take that bite, chew it, and swallow it. And so I was in the middle of that. I had a seminar and had to write a paper, like you do. And at that particular moment of my PhD experience, the church that I was restarting was getting into all sorts of trouble. All the trouble was hitting at this precise time. We're talking about divisions in the leadership that needed to be resolved. We're talking about counseling burdens where people were in distress and needed help sorting out their issues. We're talking about financial problems that were hitting the church because the money wasn't coming in fast enough or in large enough amounts, and how are we going to keep this going? All of it, all of that stress hit me at the moment when I was supposed to write a paper about Jonathan Edwards. If you know who Jonathan Edwards is, if you've ever read anything by Jonathan Edwards, you know that that is a whole other universe of stress. So I had to write this paper. How am I going to do that? When I'm under this much stress and trying to get all of this done, shouldn't I just kind of bail on something? How do I make sense of this? Well, it was an opportunity for me to build habits of prudence. Where does prudence start? The ability to look at life and say, there's a way to get through this challenge. There's a way to do this and do it right. Where does that start? It starts with one thing: trust. Prudence starts with trusting the Lord. So what I had to do in the middle of all of that stress was kind of go back over the call that the Lord had put on my life, the call that I've felt the Lord had put on my life to restart this church, the call to do a PhD program, all of these things. The Lord had led in these things, and I needed to go back over those paths and say, Lord, you led me here. The stress is large, and I've got to trust that you knew what you were doing when you led me here. So here we are in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. This is, as I've told you, the key to the entire book of Proverbs, and in many ways the key to the Christian life. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. You want to build these patterns into your life? It starts with your attitude toward God. And with me, this attitude of confidence was a kind of awe or reverent fear. Lord, I am calling you by your name. You are the sovereign over my life. And I'm not going to defy you. I am not going to complain at you. I'm not going to ignore you. I'm going to trust you because you have proven yourself over and over again. And in this challenge, I believe you will prove yourself again. And I had to do that every day for weeks over the stresses of this period in my life. I want you to think about what we just reenacted here this morning, the communion table. What did we say when we took the bread symbolizing the body of Christ and the cup symbolizing the blood of Christ? What were we saying here? Paul says, you proclaim the Lord's death. Let's put it in Proverbs terms. Wisdom made the world and created the system of life, both physically and morally. Wisdom did that. Wisdom came into the world it created. Wisdom in the person of Jesus Christ joined us in this life, and not just joined us in it, but submitted himself to death on a cross at our hands. And do you know why he did that? Yeah, Pastor, we're in church. I know the answer to that question. To forgive us our sins. Correct answer. You know why else he did that? To give us his life. There is life after sin. Oh, that's good news. When we get it wrong, Jesus, wisdom, came into this world to restore our life. So, question to you, given that Jesus did this, can you trust him with your troubles? Can you trust him to lead you as you rebuild habits of virtue in your life? Let me put this differently. We're not trying to make Jesus happy by building habits of virtue. That's not the point of Proverbs. The point of Proverbs is you're in a fallen world. It's difficult. You need to sustain your life. You need to grow. You need to flourish. God is the source of that flourishing. And He will sustain you. He will raise you up. He will teach you. He is gracious. We need to trust Him to do that. There is no prudence without trusting God. Prudence looks at the future. Who has the future? God does. Prudence needs resources and wants to manage resources well so that we can meet our obligations. Who has all the resources? God does. Prudence begins with trusting God. That's why Proverbs 1:7 is there. Prudence is built on foresight. So foresight is looking down the line, looking down the road and saying, there's stuff coming up here, and I need to be ready for it. Now, when I was trying to write that paper on Jonathan Edwards, I saw stuff coming down the road that was not good. As I told you, I saw leadership divisions, counseling issues. I saw unforeseen demands on time. I saw my energy going from here all the way down here into the red zone. And there's this paper that I've committed to writing. So foresight looks ahead at all of this and says, this stuff's coming up. What am I going to do about this? Prudence anticipates issues and starts work early. So one of the things that God taught me how to do over years in ministry is to kind of look ahead and say, I know these issues are coming. Now how am I going to address them? And that calls for a third thing in building prudence, insight. So this is saying what really matters here, what is essential here, and what is just secondary. What is the biggest, most important thing in this situation, and what things can I afford to let go? Well, in my situation, there were a lot of competing priorities. So I had a priority of getting the paper written. I needed to do that, or I wasn't going to pass the seminar. Now, did this need to be a work of fantastic literature? Did it need to be a work of startling genius, or what was the title of that memoir that was fake? Anyway, a work of agonizing genius or whatever it was. No, it doesn't need to be any of that. It just needs to be a paper that gets the job done. What's essential here? Do it. Get it done. Leave the secondary things to one side. Now, what are the essential things in relation to the church? Maybe I could say something imprudent. Maybe I could say, the paper is all that matters. The church has to fend for itself. Well, that would be wildly imprudent, a failure of discernment. I would have failed to see what really mattered. I needed to pay attention to all of those things. And so, prudence for me was a pattern, a habit of looking ahead each week and saying, okay, here's what I see on the horizon. Here's what needs to be taken care of. And here's how I'm going to do the work that I need to do. And it also called for the insight to say, this week, what really matters is this. The secondary things are all over here. So that was some of the ways that I built that pattern. And I found that working this way gave me options. I'll tell you what I mean. Here's how I decided to write the paper. I decided I'm going to write 400 words or a couple of paragraphs every day. That's all. I'm not going to worry about all of the rest of the paper. I'm just going to write those couple of paragraphs. I'm going to write 400 words every day, and I'm just going to keep right on plugging. And then I'm going to spend that hour doing that, and then I'm going to go back to being a pastor and do all of the other things that I need to do. And so what I found was this gave me options. Well, when are you going to write the 400 words? Are you going to write them in the morning? You're going to write them in the afternoon? Well, I can write them anytime. I can write them at 10 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock in the morning. I can arrange my day according to the needs of that day. But I know what the priority is. 400 words today, that's all. We're going to let the rest take care of itself. I knew what the priorities were in terms of pastoring. I've just got this one counseling meeting, so I'm going to give my focus and energy to this right now. I'm going to do this for an hour. And then in the next hour, there are going to be more challenges. You see what's happening here? Everything is getting smaller. I'm working on things in bite sizes. I'm not looking at my week and saying, oh, look at all the stuff I have to do. Look at all these big, terrible things. No, it's a bunch of small things. And I'm going to do that right now. And I'm going to pay attention to the priorities and the key things. You know what this enabled me to be as a pastor? And it wasn't me. It was the Lord making this pattern in me because of His grace and His goodness. Teaching prudence to the simple. You know what it enabled me to be? It enabled me to show up in a meeting, in a counseling session, or in some other preaching like this, present, calm, focused, and useful. And it enabled me to serve, which is what I needed to do. Because I was just focusing on small things, bite-sized things. One of the things that folly tells you is that you have big decisions to make. Can I put it to you? You really don't. Prudence says you don't have big decisions to make. You have lots of small decisions to make. So make them as they come up. Take them one at a time. Do your 400 words a day. Go to the meeting. Be calm. Trust God. Marshal your resources to the key priorities. This is a habit of prudence. Are you overwhelmed? Oops. I am. I just restarted my presentation. There's Derek, and see how calm I am? This isn't bothering me at all. All I have to do is not push the wrong button. So, what was I saying? Are you overwhelmed? Yeah, like me. What you need to do is, first of all, realize that it is not your job in God's economy to be a superhuman and to get everything right the first time. All your job is to learn prudence. That's it. That is wisdom. And Jesus died and rose again to give it to you. That's all. So you stand on His work and you embrace the challenges. And if you do this week after week, month after month, year after year, can I put it to you? You will have a new emotional life. Or I could put this differently. You don't have to be the slave of your emotions, the slave of your stress. You don't have to be at the beck and call of every negative thing that happens to you. You can stand on Christ, and you can call on His name, you can pray, and you can marshal the resources you have and make lots of small decisions while you trust Him. It's empowering, and it's life-changing. You know, I talk about this paper. I got the paper written. I turned it in, and it was the craziest thing. My professor, I was supposed to turn in a draft, and then he was supposed to give comments, you know, this trick, and they tell you everything that's wrong with it, and then you go back and revise it and hope for the best. That deal. So I turned it in for his comments. He wrote back, and I was just expecting to get slaughtered, the whole red ink thing, and, you know, because it's terrible. I wrote 400 words a day. I didn't even read the stuff I'd already written until I got to the very end and said, oh, I guess I'd better proofread this. And I just read it and turned it in, and okay, do your worst, Prof. He wrote back, this paper does not need any changes, A. I don't know how that happened. I'll tell, and it's not this, because this was totally preoccupied with all of the mess of life. So it wasn't this. This was not focused. I know, I was there. I'll tell you what else happened. That paper eventually became a chapter in my dissertation, and it eventually got published in a journal. And when I pulled up the file to revise it for my dissertation and work it into that whole thing, I had no memory of writing that paper. I didn't recognize it. You know how when you pull up an old file, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember where I was when I wrote that howler right there. And no, I couldn't remember writing it. That's how much stress I was under. Prudence frees you to be the small person that you are, the limited person that you are. Prudence says, life's small, so do the small stuff. Do it repeatedly. Let me ask you a couple of questions, because the great thing about putting wisdom under a microscope is you come away with tests, like any lab. So here are 2 tests. Where are you on this? First question, what is your attitude toward being taught? What we're really saying is, submit to God, revere Him, be in awe of Him, submit to Him and fear Him. Hold Him in that kind of reverence and honor. What does that do inside when I use that language? What's your attitude toward being taught? Well, I want to argue with them, of course. I want to state my opinion. I want it to come out my way. I want this thing, I'm gonna push and push and push. I'm going to use all my smarts to push back. Not wisdom. Wisdom says, I'm being taught. Give me more. Tell me more. I have some wisdom. I'll try to use it, but I need more. Lord, give me more. So what is your attitude toward being taught? And I'm asking you to be clinical about this. How do you respond in real life when you are taught? That tells you where you are in relation to this habit, this virtue of prudence. Second test here. How do you use time in your decision making? Well, I don't use it. I freeze up. I'm paralyzed by it. I can't use time. It's the thing that's stressing me out. You know, the prudence this habit of making lots of small decisions instead of stressing out over one big one, this habit means that time is your friend. And in a strange sort of way, that's what I found out in writing that paper in such a stressful time. 400 words a day, it's the time I've got, it's the quota. I used it, and it came out. And there were lots of good things to come out of this. Circling back to what we're talking about here, we put wisdom under a microscope, we discover that it has behaviors, patterns that it exhibits, and those patterns are called virtues. And your only job as a Christian is to be in the process of learning them and internalizing them. And Jesus is the one who enables you to do this. I forgot to check for questions. Looks like we may have one. How come future planning and prudence are praised in this passage, but discouraged in other passages like James? So James famously says, look, don't say you're going to go to this city and you got all these big hot plans there and you're going to sell this stuff and you're going to make all this money. You don't even know the future. You don't know what's going to happen. So instead say, if the Lord wills, then I will go and do this. So why does Proverbs praise it and James kind of poo-poo it? It's really pretty simple. They're attacking the same issue from different perspectives. James is attacking this issue from the perspective of an arrogant person, let's say, as somebody who says, I've got all the answers, I've got this wired, I know what to do. And Proverbs is maybe coming at it more generally and saying, well, if you don't know what to do, there are ways to learn. Where James is just saying, if you think you know, if you think you've got all the answers already, there's a lot you don't know, and the future is one of the biggest things you don't know. So same kind of principle, different points of view on that.